So far, you've been able to break up your programs into a series of steps using methods. And this has been wonderful for organizing your code. However, you've probably hit that pesky cannot find symbol error when you try to pass variables between the methods. Up until now, you haven't really had a way for methods to take information in and then send it back out. Well, that's where parameters and returns come in. Let's say we have a set of instructions for how to bake cookies. Well, these are chocolate chip cookies, and they take certain amounts of different ingredients. If we were to say isolate the things that we know are going to change based on if we were to bake, say, oatmeal cookies, well, then we can still reuse so much of this recipe and just change the few things that need to be changed. If we were to turn this into a program, essentially what we could do is we could create a method that lets us make any type of cookies, and then we just need to tell it the few pieces that we know are going to change. This makes this code very flexible. And the way that we would pass information in to make these changes is something called a parameter. A parameter is a way to pass information into a method. You declare parameters between the parentheses of the method header, and you need to give them a data type and a name. Once you do that, then it's just like you have a variable within that method. So in this case, we can pass in parameters at the call of the method, and then they're all saved under the name of that same parameter. This gives us the opportunity to essentially have the same code behave differently based on the different values that we give it. So in one case, we could give it a value of 4, and that's the value that would be stored in the parameter. In another case, we give it 2, resulting in 2 different outputs from the same piece of code. When you're creating a parameter, you can actually add as many parameters as you like to a method. You can take in as much information as you like. You simply need to separate the parameters by commas. So you would have between the parentheses the type of the parameter, the name, comma, and then however many you would like to have. Parameters are just like variables. Once you've declared them in the method header and you've passed them in at the call of the method, then you just refer to them by name. The tricky thing about parameters is they are just like variables in that their scope only exists within the method. So once you take in that information and manipulate it, it only lives within that method instance. You can have as many variables as you like, of any different type, including primitives and strings. You could have repeat parameters of the same type. You could take in 10 ints, or you could take in 10 different types, whatever you need. Here's an example of a method that takes in 2 different parameters of 2 different types. You just have to make sure that they all have unique names. When you're giving the information to the method to use, you have to make sure that you're giving it in the right value, or in the right order. So in this case, you have your method call with the method name, and then you pass in the values separated by commas. Remember, order matters. So whatever value you pass in first, that's going to correspond to the first variable. So if you mess up and you pass in the wrong type, you're going to get an error. Or if you have variables of the same type, you need to make sure that you're very strategic about which order you pass in the values at the call, because that's what's going to be reflected in the actual running of the method. So in this case, we can pass in multiple values, and we can get the different results based on the order of the values we pass in. Now, the problem with parameters is, like I said, their scope only exists within a method. So once you do all this wonderful work, well, it only lives within that method. And once that method instance finishes, it goes away. So what do you do in order to save all of that great work that you did inside your method so that it can, say, be used in other methods, or maybe it's going to be reflected up in the main method? Well, let's introduce the return. The return is sort of the opposite of the parameter, in that if a parameter gives information into a method, a return gives information out of the method. Every method can have up to 1 parameter. And the way that you declare that is you replace that void keyword with whatever data type you're going to be returning. Then whatever information you want to return, you use the keyword return and then the value, and then essentially the computer is going to turn your method call into an expression that results in the return. So you can capture it up in the main method. You can think of parameters and returns as working together as one. You might pass information into a method, it's going to do some amount of work, and then pass information back out. And then you can do the same thing with the same method again and get different results. Again, you want to update the type of data that you want to return within the method header, and then you need to use the keyword return somewhere within your method. If you don't remember to use the keyword return, you're going to get an error. Once you return something in a method, you're signaling to the computer that all of your work is done. So let's say you put return and then a value at the very first line of your method. That's going to stop the execution of the method and immediately jump back to the method call. So make sure that your return is the last thing in your method. Then once it's returned, you want to capture that value up at the call of the method. So often you'll want to say have a variable that's set equal to the result of your method call. Since you now have a few different things to keep in mind, let's talk about some of the most common errors. One of the most common things with parameters is you can do a great job declaring them in the method header, but when you call the method, you can forget to pass them in. This will cause an error. If you define parameters within the method header, whenever you call that method, you're going to be expected to give that information. Also, it's really easy to forget about data types. Whatever data type you declare in the method header has to match whatever data you pass in at the call. It's also really easy to forget the order of your parameters, especially because if you have parameters of the same type, you're not going to get an error if you pass in the wrong order. With returns, it's super easy to forget to actually return something. You do all this great work, but then you end your method without ever using the return keyword. But don't worry, Java will remind you and give you an error. On the opposite side, sometimes you know you want to return something and you put your return keyword in there, but you forget to update the method header, and so that void keyword is still in there, so Java will give you an error. It's like, hey, you're returning and I wasn't expecting that. But possibly the most common mistake is dropping the return. Okay, you've passed in information to your method, you've done all this great work, you've returned it out, and then you do nothing with it at the call site. And this doesn't actually result in an error by the compiler or the runtime. You're just going to get not the data you want. So always remember that if you're returning something from your method, you better be capturing it or doing something with that information up at the call site of the method. Now that you have a way to send information in and out of your methods, your programs can be really well structured. And you can think of methods as individual tasks. Not only are they separating up big blocks of code, but it's sort of like each method is a little worker, and they are given some information, they do some work, and then they pass it back. They follow the same control flow as before, but now you have a way to get all of your information everywhere it needs to be and to split up the work in a way that makes it easy for you to program and maintain your code.